This film is about a help from above by a divine messenger, to help a man in trouble. It opens with a whimsical portrayal of holy messengers in paradise examining an issue that has come up. They are getting supplications from humans, as please, God, something's the matter with Daddy. George Bailey, James Stewart, is going to off himself, and they need to send a holy messenger rational to stop him. They select Clarence, Henry Travers, a fairly down on his karma heavenly messenger who hasn't procured his wings yet who they choose is ideal for the gig. The senior holy messengers guarantee that Clarence will get his wings assuming he succeeds. The main part of the film is a replaying of George's life, by the senior holy messengers and for Clarence's advantage, so Clarence will grasp George. George Bailey was a young fellow, living in a little upstate New York town, however with huge dreams. Since the beginning, he needed to move away from Bedford Falls, venture to the far corners of the planet, and get large things done, arranging urban communities and building colossal runways, high-rises, and extensions. The principal occurrence that Clarence sees is that, at age 12, George saved his more youthful sibling Harry's, Todd Carnes, life in a mishap while playing on an ice-shrouded lake. George lost the consultation in his past on ear due to being in the frosty water. Soon after that, while working part-time in Mr. Gower's, H.B. Warner, pharmacy, he keeps a slip-up in a remedy from lethally harming somebody. Irate at the ignored conveyance, Gower, savored the distress at the new passing of his child, beats George until the kid makes sense of the circumstance. After testing the medication and understanding the kid had deflected a terrible misstep, Gower is significantly sorry and thankful to George, who commits to hush up about the blunder. The two young ladies in George's day-to-day existence by then are Mary Trapdoor, Donna Reed, and Violet Bick, Gloria Graham, who appear to be vying for his notification. George's dad, Samuel S. Hines, with a little staff including Uncle Billy, Thomas Mitchell, run a little structure and credit organization that funds contracts for individuals of Bedford Falls. They face a troublesome fight with the malicious, voracious, and rich Henry Potter, Lionel Barrymore. The wheelchair-bound Mr. Potter is on the top managerial staff of the structure and credit, holds quite a bit of its resources, alongside nearly all the other things around, charges individuals over the top lease on his own condos, and might want to take Bailey's organization of down. George needs to start his undertaking subsequent to attending a university. While he has gigantic regard for his dad and how he is helping individuals, he most certainly doesn't have any desire to emulate his dad's example at the structure in advance. Be that as it may, an endless series of things ruins his arrangements. George went to work at the structure and credit for a couple of years in the wake of moving on from secondary school, with the assumption that Harry would take this over when he graduated, and George would go on an European visit and afterwards set off for college. However, his dad has a deadly stroke, and George needs to assume control over the B&L for a couple of months, surrendering the European visit. Then, at that point, Potter endeavors to sell the B&L. The main thing that can stop it is for George himself to take it over. So he surrenders school, and gives his school cash to Harry. The arrangement by then was that, after Harry graduates, he will assume control over the B&L, and George will attend a university. Yet, Harry gets back from school having hitched Ruth Dakin, and Ruth's dad has extended to him an employment opportunity in upstate New York. In spite of the fact that Harry commits to turn it down for the good of George, George can't tolerate costing his sibling the open door, so he must choose the option to remain with the B&L. George weds Mary Trapdoor after a troublesome presentation. He erroneously thinks Mary is infatuated with his deep-rooted rival Sam Wainwright, Forthright Albertson. They are going to go on their special night with $2,000 they have set aside. Yet, a financial emergency happens. Potter has assumed control over the bank that insures the B&L's credits, and has brought in the advances. The clients are in a frenzy and are enticed to head toward Potter's bank. The main way George can save what is going on is to accommodate the client's necessities out of his special night cash. Their companions Ernie, straightforward Phelan, the cabbie and Bert, ward security, the cop set up for them to have a cut-rate special first night at their home. They serenade the lovebirds from outside in the downpour. The B&L keeps on giving reasonable lodging to individuals of Bedford Falls, making an entire region Bailey Park. This incorporates the home of Mr. Martini, William Edmonds, the nearby bar manager, and his loved ones. Sam Wainwright and his significant other drop by to offer that George and Mary get away with them in Florida, yet they can't move away in any event, for that. Potter is upset that George's B&L is removing clients from his own condo business, and endeavors to pay off George into working for him, all things being equal, offering an immense compensation and broad travel. Enticing as that is, George is repulsed by all that Potter represents, and declines. So George stays with his significant other and 4 kids in Bedford Falls, never getting to leave. The Second Great War goes back and forth, and Harry serves. George is absolved due to his ear, and bravely saves a whole vehicle transport by killing 2 going after planes. He is granted the Legislative Decoration of Distinction at a function in Washington. On the morning before Christmas, the day that Bedford Falls will have an enormous festival for Harry, a bank inspector shows up to lead a standard review. That very day, Uncle Billy goes to the bank for a standard store of $8,000 in real money. Potter occurs by, and Billy gladly brings up the paper with the report about Harry. He coincidentally creases the paper with the money envelope in it, and Potter takes it back. Billy then understands that he has lost the cash. Potter, presently in another room, sees this, and slips away. Billy shows up at the B&L, where George, liberal as usual, is giving Violet his very own portion cash for her to make a trip to New York City and begin another life. At the point when Billy enlightens George concerning the misfortune, there is a ruckus. George and Billy search wherever that the cash might actually have been left. George yells at Billy that this implies liquidation, outrage and jail, and that he, George, isn't the person who will go to jail. George returns home in a staggeringly foul state of mind, where his family are planning for a Christmas celebration that night. George is very unpleasant and terrible, and loudly mishandles everybody, saying at a certain point, "For what reason do we must have this multitude of children?" The entire family are frightened at his way of behaving. He discovers that their most youthful little girl Zuzu, Carolyn Grimes, is sleeping with a virus. She evidently found it heading back home from school, having not secured her jacket since she would have rather not hurt a rose that she had been given. George goes up to see her. While taking care of the rose, a few petals tumble off. George places them in his watch pocket. Zuzu's instructor, Mrs. Welch, telephones to get some information about Zuzu. George gives her a severe reprimanding over her lack of regard. At the point when Mr. Welch gets on the line, George mishandles and compromises him. Then George begins kicking and tossing things. The youngsters are in tears. George won't discuss what's up or what is annoying him and tempests out of the house. Mary telephones Uncle Billy to figure out what's up. The youngsters find out if they ought to petition God for their dad, and Mary says okay. While word spreads of the catastrophe, George goes to see Mr. Potter to ask for a credit of $8,000. Mr. Potter is totally unsympathetic and wry. He recommends that George has been cooking the books, profiting from trading stocks with organization cash, or maybe taking care of a lady, bringing up that he is known to have been giving cash to Violet Bick. Potter gets some information about insurance. The sum total of what George has is a $15,000 extra security strategy, yet with just $500 value. Mr. Potter says you're worth more dead than alive. George goes to Mr. Martini's bar and starts drinking, and afterward appealing to God for divine direction. His companions, including the sort and delicate barkeep Scratch, Sheldon Leonard, notice and attempt to help. Mr. Martini makes reference to George's name without holding back, and Mr. Welch, Stanley Andrews, the spouse of the educator that George offended for no great explanation via phone prior, sitting close by, hears it. He punches George, causing a horrendous lip. George leaves, however his companions ask him to remain and rest. George drives his vehicle toward an extension. Due to the frigid climate, he inadvertently drives it into a tree. The property holder emerges and criticizes him for hurting the tree. George simply continues to stroll, out onto the scaffold, to commit suicide. Similarly, as George is going to hop into the cold waterway and suffocate, Clarence comes rational. His second has come. He realizes George all right to know that in the event that he, Clarence, bounces into the stream, George will protect him. He does as such, and George bounces in and salvages him as anticipated. They go to the cost-taker's shack to dry their garments. Clarence makes sense of all, that he is a holy messenger, Clarence owed body, holy messenger inferior, shipped off save George from ending it all. To George's amazement, Clarence knows the entire story of his life. George is doubting and pessimistic about the entire thing, referencing that it isn't his business as usual that he got just an inferior holy messenger, one without wings. He opposes Clarence's supplications, accepting that he probably consumed polluted alcohol. He at long last says, "I wish I'd never been conceived." Clarence concocts his game plan, and, after a little devout correspondence with the senior holy messengers, says, "You have your desire. You've never been conceived." Things change right away. In the imaginary world it isn't snowing. George sees that he can hear through his left ear, and his lip isn't dying. Clarence calls attention to that numerous things will be different at this point. As George and Clarence stroll back toward town, they pass the tree that George had hit with his vehicle. The vehicle is gone, and there is no slice in the tree. The mortgage holder comes by, and George gets some information about the vehicle and the harm to the tree. The mortgage holder doesn't know anything about this. He says, "You had me stressed." One of the most established trees in Pottersville. George is confounded, and attempts to address the man. However, the man furiously lets George know that the town is called Pottersville. George and Clarence stroll off. They go on into town. Martini's bar has turned into an unpleasant plunge, and Mr. Martini is mysteriously gone. It is currently claimed by the barkeep Scratch, however, who is presently extremely awful and annoying. George and Clarence take a seat at the bar. Clarence's amiable discourse and disposition quickly disappoint Scratch. George knows Scratch, yet Scratch doesn't know George. Whenever a sales register rings, Clarence brings up that, at whatever point that occurs, it implies a heavenly messenger has procured his wings. An older Mr. Gower, presently a destitute forsaken, comes in, and Scratch advises him to leave. George addresses Mr. Gower, however Mr. Gower doesn't remember him. At the point when George gets some information about the person, Scratch says that Mr. Gower burned through 20 years in jail for harming some youngster in a murder allegation, and that if this more bizarre knows Mr. Gower, he should be a convict too. Scratch has George and Clarence tossed out of the bar, and afterward mockingly makes the sales register ring, saying that he is giving out holy messenger wings. Before the bar, George is truly upset by what is happening when he sees the sign for Scratch's instead of Martini's name. Clarence makes sense of by and by that George doesn't exist from that wish he made that he was rarely conceived. George raises the issue that assuming he was rarely conceived and is alive and associating with individuals, then, at that point, who is he? Clarence answers that George is an individual with no personality in this substitute reality. George really looks at his pockets for his wallet, other distinguishing proof, or his disaster protection strategy. Clarence calls attention to that they don't exist. At last, George checks his watch pocket. Clarence says they're not there by the same token. "What?" George inquires. "Zuzu's petals. You've been given an incredible gift, George. The opportunity to see what the world would resemble without you." Proceeding to be trying to claim ignorance of what is happening, George keeps on strolling downtown without Clarence. Bedford Falls has become Pottersville, and it is a horrid, brutish, and unreasonable spot, loaded with bars and unpleasant clubs. The cinema, the retail outlet retail chain, and the B&L, are a distant memory. Police are all over, managing messes. George sees the police capture Violet and remove her from a massage parlor which is the previous B&L. He flags down Ernie's taxi and requests to be brought back home. Ernie has no clue about what his identity is or where he resides. He gives Ernie the location, and Ernie lets him know that that is a neglected house, however he will take him there at any rate. At the point when George gets some information about his life, Ernie lets George know that his significant other left him quite a while back, and that he currently resides alone in a spot called Potter's Field. He outwardly flags for Bert the police officer to follow them. As George looks through the house calling out for his family, Clarence shows up. Bert endeavors to capture them, yet Clarence intercedes and afterward evaporates, permitting George to get away. George then, at that point, goes to his mom's home, which has ended up being a separated lodging called Mama Bailey's Motel. She opens the front entryway, yet she doesn't remember him and advises him to leave. George makes reference to Uncle Billy, and she says that he has been in a mental hospital since the B&L left business a long while back. Still willfully ignorant of what's going on, George then goes with Clarence to Martini's home in Bailey Park. There is no such spot, it is a no man's land with a burial ground. Clarence calls attention to the grave of Harry Bailey. Clarence says your sibling Harry Bailey got through the ice and was suffocated at 9 years old. That is obviously false. Harry Bailey did battle. He got the Legislative Decoration of Honor. He saved the existences of each and every man on that vehicle. says George. Each man on that transport kicked the bucket. Harry wasn't there to save them, since you weren't there to save Harry. George, you truly had a great life. Don't you see what a misstep it is discarded? George then requests to see Mary. Clarence says that she never wedded, and works at the library. George goes there. She doesn't remember him. He attempts to embrace her. She shouts and runs into a dance club. He pursues her, yet is defied by a group made of numerous he knows. However, they obviously have no acknowledgement of this out-of-control man they have never met before in this reality. At long last, mindful of what's going on, George calls out for Clarence as the police intercede. George slugs Bert and takes off. Bert takes shots at him yet misses, then, at that point, seeks after in his crew vehicle. George hurries to the extension where he had been going to hop, and calls out, "Help me, Clarence, please. If it's not too much trouble. Once more, I need to live." He sadly gets back to God bring him. With that request, the imaginary world unexpectedly closes. Yet again it's snowing. Bert shows up in his squad car, and shouts to George that he's been searching for him, since seeing his vehicle blasted through the tree. He additionally calls attention to that George's lip is dying. George is really glad to hear this, and to realize that Bert knows him. He checks his watch pocket, the flower petals are there. George is elated. Yet again he runs into town, which is Bedford Falls, and is generally its natural establishments, which he welcomes with unbounded euphoria. He even wishes Mr. Potter a happy holidays, who mockingly wishes him a cheerful new year in prison considering the specialists are hanging tight for him at home. George gets back, realizing that he will probably be captured for bank extortion. The authorities are there, prepared to capture him. In any case, George staggers them by his joy at his capture warrant, particularly since his youngsters are there likewise, and all have an euphoric gathering. Mary gets back home, alongside many individuals drove by Uncle Billy. As opposed to Mr. Potter's case that they would abhor him for losing their cash, it worked out that when news spread that George was in monetary difficulty, the residents that he had been so liberal to had offered anything they might give. Many individuals show up, with an entire clothing bushel brimming with cash, gems, and different resources. A message shows up from Sam Wainwright in Europe, saying that he had been reached by Mr. Gower about the circumstance, and would progress up to $25,000 to cover the obligation on the B&L. At this, the bank inspector, both moved by this demonstration of public help and realizing that the monetary shortfall will be redressed, climbs to contribute, and the going to cop destroys the capture warrant cheerfully. Unexpectedly, Harry shows up from New York, having quickly left his honor feast after hearing that his sibling required his help, and toasts to my older sibling George. The most extravagant man around. In the last scene, as the entire group sings "Look the Envoy Heavenly Messengers Sing," and afterward Auld Lang Syne, George finds a duplicate of the experiences of Tom Sawyer with a short transcribed note on the internal pages in his inside coat pocket. It peruses, "Dear George. Recollect no man is a disappointment who has companions. Gratitude for the wings. Love, Clarence." When Mary asks what Clarence's identity is, George, very much aware she could never accept the entire story, simply says it is a Christmas present from an extremely dear companion. At that point, a ringer on the Christmas tree rings. Zuzu says, "Look, Daddy." According to instructor, each time a ringer rings, a heavenly messenger gets his wings. George says, "Believe it or not. Truth be told." And, looking upward, "Attaboy, Clarence."